Welcome to the second Quaker Focus programme. The next 6 programmes will focus on one of the Quaker values or testimonies of simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality and sustainability. A good description of a testimony is given by Australian Quakers. A testimony is neither a rule nor a creed. It is both an ideal to strive for and a way for our lives to speak. No testimony stands alone. They are like the threads which we weave in and out of each other to create the material of our lives. Quakers try to live up to their testimonies and almost always fall short. Today I have with me David Elms, Rosemary Treadgold and Katie Sinton, and we will be discussing the first of the testimonies, that of simplicity. And to start off with, David, I'd like to ask you what you understand by Quaker simplicity. You ran a workshop around simplicity some time ago, and I'd be interested in your perception.
Yes, it was quite an exciting workshop, really, quite a long one. It had sessions over 2 days, and a few interesting things came out which I hadn't expected. One of which was that simplicity certainly is not simple. In a way, we seem to gravitate to thinking of it as a way of interacting with the world, and in so doing, it's something that needs practice, just as learning to play a musical instrument. You can't just assume that because you do nothing, simplicity will happen. And of course, even in the length of those workshops, we couldn't cover everything. We basically focused on simplicity, firstly in everyday life, and secondly in our spiritual lives, as it were. But we certainly didn't go into the Quaker history of it, for example. We ended up with yet more to think about. It was much more of an experiential thing in which we could simply grow in our understanding.
Mm-hmm. So, Katie, have you got anything to add to that, or anything that you would like to observe?
Well, all my life, this particular testimony has spoken to me very strongly. And as David said just now, simplicity isn't simple. And I've certainly found that. It's a thing that has to be worked at and is often very complicated. And that was certainly something that came out in the workshops. I've asked myself why it is that it's always spoken to me so strongly, and I have absolutely no idea, but it does. And it means things like, well, on a physical level, not having too much clutter, but in a sort of mental level, not having too much clutter as well, in order that the important things can be seen more clearly. I think that's the point, that the testimony of simplicity is an aid for seeing what's really important in life and not getting distracted by all sorts of other things.
So you say that simplicity is not necessarily uncomplicated?
Generally speaking, I find it to be complicated.
Could you give me an example?
How do we decide from many competing choices which one to take? That's often not at all easy. How do we reduce physical clutter in a world where our worth in some ways is measured as by how much we consume? How do you stand against that? In a world where there's a constant barrage of information coming at us, how do we simplify that to hear the important things and cut out the unimportant things? How do we even decide what are the important things and the unimportant things? So it's a constant practice at having it in mind when making choices in all sorts of ways.
Have you got any hints for our listeners as to how people might do that?
Sitting in the meeting for worship on a Sunday morning and consciously letting go of a lot of the superficial things that float around in my mind, I find that is a useful way for me of getting closer to what's important. But mainly, I think I would say it's having it in mind as a possibility that you could actually... Well, we all have to make choices. And what measure do we use when we're making a choice? And for me, one of the measures is this testimony of simplicity.
So you've got a constant sort of awareness of the testimony at the back
Yes.
of your mind, sort of thing that's guiding you as you go on.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, not 100% of the time, but it's there most of the time.
Yeah. Rosemary, what's your perceptions around simplicity?
Well, I was interested thinking about this and reading a bit more about Quaker history. And at times, being simple seemed to be such an important part of the history and the behaviour. And then sometimes the being simple took over, and it was more important to be perceived as being rigidly simple than the testimony behind it. So I see this as two-dimensional. Partly the actual behaviour of what I do and what we do. And I think this is increasingly important today in a world of so many choices and so many possibilities that we have to find a way through it, as it were. And the more I read, the more I realised that the important thing is the kind of belief, and the testimony is about one's spiritual belief and one's aim spiritually. And if I can get in touch with my spiritual belief, then the way through this concatenation of events, possibilities around me becomes much clearer. And you're going to ask me how I do that. Well, I think one of the things I do that is Katie suggested going to meeting, and meeting as a form of meditation. But also there's the joining together with other people who share a spiritual belief. But I am also concerned that as Quakers, we stay with the view of simplicity, not in, are we better than anybody else at being simple? Are we better than anybody else and having less clutter? Because that, for me, is not the essence of the meaning of the testimony at all.
So, in today's world, what is the value of simplicity?
One of the values for me of simplicity is a consideration of, if I, for instance, buy something or do something, does this fit in with the conservation of the world? Does it fit in with using the planet to its own purpose? So those would be important aspects for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to add to that, David?
The whole idea of simplicity does relate very much to, I suppose, the whole of my career and what I've been trying to do professionally and in living and in spiritual area, of trying to be clear, trying to cut through to really what matters. And so one thing that comes out to me about this whole thing is that, look, don't get stuck on the idea of needing to know a definition of simplicity, but rather the powerful thing is to use a word like simplicity, and indeed use simplicity itself as a word, as a window. You open that window and you go through, you look through, you see so many other aspects of things. And if you take that view and start thinking about it and trying it out on life and so on and so forth, well, that's how I have found it's an extremely powerful thing in my living and work.
So for you, it's a living quality, a living value.
It's a living value. It's a skill, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
It's a skill which I think I've earned, really, in a way, by just working at it for many, many years. To understand it, I think it's a good idea to think of words and ideas which are contrary to simplicity and those which line up with simplicity. An example of a lining up word would be clarity. And we've already heard about muddle and clutter as being enemies of simplicity. And so if I were to look through that window, of simplicity, I would be mulling over, well, how do I deal with clutter? Or how do I enhance clarity?
Simplicity for me, it's not really that simplicity is an end in itself, but like the other testimonies, it's a means to an end. And one way I could describe that end is what I'm aiming to do is to try to lead a good life, a life that contributes rather than takes away from other people, contributes to the world rather than damages the world. So part of when David spoke about simplicity opening a window, it helps, or indeed I could say it opens a door. It's one of the doors into this good life that could be led, that I can kind of glimpse as being a possibility. And it's a door to that because if I fill my life up with complicated stuff, I do too many things, or the things I'm doing are too difficult, I'll have less time to think about. I won't see what's important. I won't have as much time to do the things that are important because I'm expending my energies on other things. Mm-hmm. So simplicity, like the other testimonies, can be seen as paths towards this good life.
Rosemary.
What you have raised for me, Katie, in that is the question of where my focus is at. Is my focus on what my mother used to call the eternal, but the spiritual things of life? Or is it on the other aspects like keeping up with my neighbours? Do I have to have the latest car? At the moment, my present one is, should I really clean the car because it is the dirtiest one around? And for reasons, it's very difficult for me physically to clean a car at the moment. But that's not the issue. The issue is, where is my focus? Is it on doing what other people do, or is it on a deeper aspect? And I'm not sure that yes, I agree with David that it's a skill, but I think it's more than that, in that it's a skill that's also used often, and it's very easy not to use a skill, mm-hmm. even if we have it.
So does it, most skills, it seems to me, get easier with practice? Is that your experience with simplicity?
Yes, but I'm also getting older, and the culture of getting older and passing into a gold card state is that one naturally doesn't worry quite so much. If you remember, as I'm now over 60, I can wear purple and not worry about it. So, yes, it gets easier, but there's a thing of age there too.
I think that Rosemary's focusing on two issues. One is what you focus on, but the second one is the clarity of your focus, because that's another thing which is very easy to let the clarity of focus slip. And it's this maintaining of a clarity which is a self-empowerment. Now you then have to say empowered for what, because that's really critical. That's what I find. Mm-hmm. I am empowered by what I find from simplicity.
In what way are you empowered?
Oh, in different ways. Spiritually, I think I'm able sometimes to see through things which I find really powerfully exciting, that I should have been knowing years ago, but I just haven't seen. In my work, I often have to deal with very complex situations, and somehow I have a talent now for cutting through these to the essence of what they're about, and so I still find people coming and asking me to help them.
Rosemary, you were talking about having read a bit about the history of Quakers and simplicity. I wonder how it came about that Quakers chose simplicity as one of the testimonies.
As I understood it, it was at a time when what you wore was really important. There were a whole lot of rules in society, and Quakers attempted to cut through some of this and make statements. So they wore simple clothes. I always remember going to, this is not historical, I always remember going to a conference in Auckland, an international conference, and the people in the place we were staying at looked at us very strangely and said, "You don't wear funny hats." And I remember thinking, yes, the image of Quakerism for so many people became something wearing funny hats, because the early concern to be different, to be simple, had been translated into a must, an ought. So I'm glad to say at the end of the conference, I think we managed to communicate something other than funny hats.
And so is this where the idea of Quaker grey and those sorts of things came from?
Yes, and I don't know that that's completely gone in the Quaker culture in New Zealand.
People were in the past very concerned with outward appearance, and often very extravagant outward appearance, or at the time when Quakers arose.
Mm-hmm.
And the simplicity was to say this emphasis on outward appearance is putting the emphasis in the wrong place. Not only is it a wasteful thing to do, but it means that your attention is directed to just superficial things, and your attention should be directed to eternal things. And then there's also the strand of thought that says those who spend a great deal of money on themselves are doing so at the expense of others. So there are many people who are labouring hard, not necessarily well paid, in order to enable some people to dress well. And this is terribly apt now, because we know that there are people labouring in sweatshops in Bangladesh and so on to produce the cheap fashion which so many people in the West wear. So the attitude to Quakers challenged it by saying, we're not going to put the emphasis on outward appearance, we're going to dress simply. But then, as has already been said, the original starting point of that got a bit lost, and it began to be a case of, if you're a Quaker, you must dress in this way.
And also you must not get involved with the arts and music and dance. And
that's the other aspect of it, which thankfully we've left behind. I really can't emphasise too strongly that simplicity isn't barrenness. Simplicity isn't living in well, it might be for some people to live in a very plain house with no colour, but that's your choice if that for you is good surroundings. Simplicity has room, in my view, has room for the beauty of the world and the beauty of human things like music.
Yes, I very much agree with Katie on that. I think there was a terrible stage of Quakerism where they went too far. And so they were so concerned about dressing right that they were very self-absorbed. So I think that simplicity certainly does not imply a starkness. For example, you take a room, you could make yourself a concrete cube and try and live in that with no furniture or something like that. And that would be apparently very simple. But that's not what we mean by simplicity. That's just ridiculous, taking all your energy and putting it into outward appearance, which might be self-nullification and so on and so forth, or whatever. No, I think simplicity actually implies words like quality and value and richness and focus and, above all, perhaps balance. You might say it's the Goldilocks effect. Not too much, not too little, but getting it just right, which needs a little practice given all the advertising with which we're surrounded, for example.
And that just right is going to be different for different people. And if you measure that just right by what your neighbour's doing, then it's just another version of keeping up with the Joneses, which is
not simple.
Not simple, not what we're talking about. So the testimony doesn't say you will do such and such. It says bear this in mind when you make your choices. And to me it says if you do so, then you'll benefit at a deeper level.
Rosemary?
Well, I was thinking just that it was everybody has to make their own decision about their own simple life. And you can't make a judgment about what anybody else's interpretation of simplicity is. But the other thing that interested me was how it tied up with our other testimonies of peace and of justice, that in the early days this was considered very important. And I think when I think about simplicity, and I think of a stillness, a knowingness from I use the word eternal, so I'll use the word eternal again, from an internal space, but which is also a concern for peace, and somebody else said caring for other people.
So that ties in with the introduction that from the Australian friends, no testimony stands alone. They are like threads which we weave in and out of each other to create the material of our lives.
Very much so. Yes.
They're not separable.
They
belong. It's useful to think of them separately in some ways, but they belong together.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back to this idea of the word simplicity, for example, or integrity or whatever, as being a window or a door, as Katie was saying, by the time you actually get through that door or window, that is where, at a deeper level, you see, trying to use these testimonies as guides, that's where it leads to a sort of landscape where everything joins together and bounces off each other, you might say.
David, you mentioned the idea of these testimonies as guides. Wouldn't it be a lot simpler just to say, you shall live this way, you shall do this?
No, because remember what Rosemary was just saying. One of the essences of Quakerism, in a way, is that you do it yourself, your own way. And that's what's going to be right for you. It's quite important.
So you've got to take responsibility.
You have to take responsibility, not just go by... what that means is you don't go by rules.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to work it out for yourself. And that's very fundamental to Quakerism.
It's absolutely fundamental to why I'm a Quaker. Because Quakerism doesn't say you must do this, that and the other. It's a set of guidelines for people who want the same sorts of goals in order to live by, so that they can work out the best thing for them. As we said earlier, for each of us, simplicity is going to look a little bit different, but one would expect there to be some common threads. And if I was told I must do such, and that such and such didn't accord with my inner sense of what it was, that wouldn't be a simple situation to be in at all. And by living by guidelines as opposed to rules, we allow ourselves space to grow and evolve and our ideas to mature. So for me, to be told how to be simple would be the opposite, the opposite of what I'm looking for.
So it's an individual thing, but in that case, how do Quakers support each other in their endeavours to live to the testimony of simplicity?
I think as Quakers, we come together because we recognise that in the company of the others, we're searching for the same sorts of things.
And you are searching for?
To focus on the things that are eternal, to live a good life, the things that we spoke of at the outset.
Right.
And these testimonies are, to me, the pathways to doing that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David, Katie and Rosemary. We can draw this session to a close. I'd like to remind our listeners that our next programme will be at 9 p.m. on November the 22nd, when our topic will be the Quaker Peace Testimony. If you want to find out more about Quakers, have a look at our Quake City Quakers Facebook page, or go to www.quaker.org.nz. You're also welcome to join us at Quaker Meeting on Sundays at the Quaker Centre, 217 Ferry Road at 10:30 a.m.